further. There's no need to, so why would you? But secondly, you don't try to understand the unknowable. You don't try to understand a monster, because the whole point of a monster is that we cannot understand it. A monster is a thing that is different, a thing that is outside of human conception. That's why we have the word monster. But finally, it was, even if people would inquire further and learn more about it, it was through the wrong prism. It was through the prism of thinking that zygote of Hitler was evil, and it grew up to be evil, and it was evil all its life, and it could never do anything but evil. It was a monster, rather than thinking about how the person Hitler got to the point where he did, not only politically, but also personally, how that person was able to reach that point. Looking at it through that prism meant all of that was misunderstood throughout that arc of Hitler's life and history. That was problematic. It applies to all other monsters of history as they've been labelled. Can we convey the true harms without this label? Yes, the answer was we could. Just like the introduction as the first negative speaker, you could speak to those true harms, and in fact you could speak to them better when instead of focusing on Hitler, instead of focusing on the person and the unknowable evil, you talked about the actual evil that was brought upon the Jews in Europe and upon those in Cambodia. That was what the focus should have been on, and you could better explain that evil, just like the first negative did, by talking about the wrong and not about the wrongdoer. Acts can be terrible. Acts can be monstrous, even without the person being labelled a monster themselves. Rather than being about the person, it should be about the acts. But does it harm victims to not use the label monster? Because we later on heard that the victim's truth is simple and more important. Firstly, on this issue of the strongest condemnation though, do we not give it on our side? We thought we did give the strongest condemnation. We just got rid of one of the levels of condemnation, which was calling someone a monster, and instead said their acts were the worst things possible because we talked about their acts. It was still a strongest condemnation possible. We condemned the person for the acts. We didn't condemn the person for the person. That was the important difference. But moreover, we were told that victim's truth is simplistic. Victim's truth is important. We never thought it was simplistic to that victim what went wrong. We thought they wanted to understand how their ancestors could live in a world where that happened, how that could be allowed to exist. By making the focus on the person, by making it about this person being a monster, those people were never able to understand, or the focus was never on the wrongs. There was never a focus on the wrongs. You wanted to feel guilty about the person of Hitler, but not remember the wrongs that were done to those people. We thought that distracted from what actually should happen. We thought victims could understand that complexity. We thought victims were happy to understand it. No one in this debate, and no one recommended saying that these acts were not terrible, that this person did not do terrible things, but one team actually talked about what occurred and how those terrible things happened. We thought that was better for victims when they could understand it. It was also better for those who might feel guilty as a result of voting for someone they didn't realise would turn out to be this terrible person. But finally, on preventing the future harms of evil, because this is the most important lesson of history. We were told that marginalising the supporters of Hitler, neo-Nazis, or supporters of people like Kim Jong-il, or regimes such as that, was a good thing by the opposition. We were told that you need to create social costs so that people do not engage with these groups. But the problem was, at the point at which people considered engaging with these groups, they might, for instance, go to a meeting of neo-Nazis, and at the point at which they'd done that, they could no longer get out of it, because they'd otherized themselves, they'd turned themselves into the monster, and they knew society would always reject them. Because once you become a monster, or once you are a monster, you can't change. You're the monster, rather than having done something wrong, rather than being able to be forgiven by your society for doing that wrong. And what that meant was that those people were forced to stay in that group. But it also meant that those groups were forced to act in a clandestine way, and those groups were less able to be surveilled, and you were less able to protect people from random attacks from those groups. That was particularly harmful. We also heard that this opened a harmful debate about whether things were wrong or right, or it left some ambiguity. But let's be very clear, there was no ambiguity. You condemned the acts as evil. You condemned all of those things done as evil, but you did not. The focus was not on the person themselves, that was not like opening a debate about whether the Cultural Revolution or whether the things Hitler did were harmful. That did not reopen that debate for those people. But also, Nick responded to this in great detail earlier, which the opposition seemed not to hear. Let's talk about preventing future atrocities. We were told that you were compelled to action where someone was a monster now. So for instance, you'd intervene now because there would be a monster. Firstly, we thought that was a historical label, which meant you wouldn't necessarily be compelled to action because normally the label of monster was applied after the events had occurred when you didn't intervene to prevent them in the first place. We didn't think that was a real benefit. But moreover, we thought to the extent you did take extra action by someone being called a monster and using this kind of rhetoric, it was likely to be worse action, it was likely to be more violent action. It meant you couldn't engage with, for instance, the North Korean regime, where you characterised the eternal President Kim Il-sung and all of those other historical figures of that regime as being incomprehensible monsters, and thereby Kim Jong-un as that. You couldn't engage that person diplomatically to try and prevent harm. The only option was isolation or war. We thought that was bad. When nations, even in Europe, could, on the front page of the most popular newspaper, cause further division in those countries because it was about the person and not about the policies and not about the actual evil, that was harmful to reconciliation in those places, it was harmful to all of the people involved, and that's why we should not simplify our history.
I think the third affirmative for the speech. I'd like to welcome the third negative, Lucy, whose preferred pronoun is she or they.
Mr. Speaker, when you refer to Hitler as monstrous, you morally condemn him to a far greater degree than when you say he was a bad person who was maybe influenced by the circumstances that he was in. That side of the House leaves some debate over the justification of what happened around these villains. We think that that is not a debate we want to be open in society. We support language which reflexively shuts down any discussion about these kind of people. I'm going to talk about two things in this debate. Firstly, how the narrative of characterising these people as monsters shapes our reactions and understanding of them as a society in a way that prevents this kind of thing from ever happening again. I'm secondly going to talk about the social value of using language like monster and how that provides victims with genuine justice in a way that the language that side of the House wants to use never will. So let's look at what the narrative of monster actually means. When you use a term like monster to describe someone like Hitler or to describe someone like Stalin, you create a reflexive moral repulsion to anything which is reminiscent of that person. So at any point where someone talks about an ideology or a policy which is in any way reminiscent of that person, you reflexively shut that idea down. That means that we're able to condemn groups like neo-Nazis or groups that are reminiscent of Hitler in a way that actually shuts those ideas down in society. What that side of the House wanted to tell you was the use of terms like monster makes these figures monodimensional. That's not necessarily true, right? Because if you look at post-World War II Germany, the discussion was that Hitler was a monster, but there needed to be a huge amount of soul-searching done to work out why the German people would ever give power to a monster. And that's actually the more useful discussion to have in society, to unilaterally condemn the individual, but to work out how that person ever got into a position where they had the power to do what they did. That's how you prevent those people from ever getting into power again. To absolutely morally condemn that person and their actions and everything associated with them, but then work out why the rest of the people in that country would ever buy into it. And that's where you get a discussion about things like the economic situation in Germany, the consequences of the Treaty of Versailles, and all of that goes into an explanation of how that person got into power. That's the useful discussion to have, Mr. Speaker. It's not useful to be distracted by talking about whether or not Hitler had some redeeming qualities. They wanted to tell you that it's necessary to recognise the humanity of these people. It's not clear why we want to recognise the humanity of these people, because all that does is pretend that they had any kind of redeeming features, when they're only prepared to condemn the policies and the actions that they carried out, rather than condemning the person themselves, then you don't get the same weight of conviction against them, you don't get the same irredeemably evil that we think you need to prevent that thing from ever happening again. That point got a little bit better from that side of the house when they said, well, you subsume everyone who supported them into that monstrous identity. The problem is that that's just empirically untrue. When we look at the reactions to people who followed people like Hitler or like Mao or like Stalin, we don't think that the narrative was ever that the German people were entirely monstrous. It was a confusion as to how those people could ever have given power to someone so monstrous. I think that recognizing the humanity of the people in the situation who gave power to that person who was a monster is how you prevent that from ever happening again. That's the useful discussion to have. That's what we have under our side of the house. When you can absolutely condemn that person, when you have an instinctive reaction that that person is objectively bad and everything associated with them is objectively bad. When you use more moderate language like that side of the house wants to talk about, you don't get that instinctive reaction to reject anything associated with that person or with their ideology. That's why we want to shape a narrative and a reaction which is absolute rejection of anything associated with people like Hitler or people like Stalin. Let's then secondly look at what the social value is of that narrative. The first thing we told you, which we've had just a totally inadequate response to, is to provide justice for the victims of that person. Because